point number 7 there says in our notes, the Apostle Peter wrote that the old heavens and earth would be dissolved. The old heavens and earth would be dissolved. Our text there are 2 Peter 3:10-12, Matthew 24:29, Isaiah 13:1-18, and Isaiah 34:4-6. Now, we have used 2 Peter chapter 3 as our main text in this study. Okay, so we're going to go straight to 2 Peter 3 in our Bible. We are using this one is the American King James Version, I think it is, for our text, which basically is an updated King James Version. So the these and the thous and the goeth and the cometh have all been updated into you and yours and goes and comes. Okay, but basically it's the same. The basic translation is the same as the old or the authorized King James version as it is called. But anyway, so we want to begin in verse 10 of 2 Peter chapter 3. All right, so it says there, but the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in the which the heavens shall pass away with a great noise, and the elements shall melt with fervent heat. Okay, the earth also and the works therein shall be burned up. Okay. Verse 11 says, seeing then that all these things shall be dissolved, what manner of persons ought you to be in all holy conversation and godliness? Verse 12 says, looking for and hastening to the coming of the day of God, wherein the heavens being on fire shall be dissolved, and the elements shall melt with fervent heat. Now, if you are interpreting or if you're understanding these verses as literally the heavens and the earth, these are some of the implications of a literal interpretation, right? Or some of the implications of a literal interpretation would be, the heavens being on fire shall be dissolved. Now, the heavens here are the galactic heavens. These are the heavens with the planets, the sun, the moon, the stars. These are the heavens that are spoken of here, because Peter here is echoing what Jesus said in Matthew 24:29. So if we just jump to Matthew 24:29, Jesus, speaking of the same, Jesus was the first to mention this. So Peter was referring back to what Jesus said here. Jesus says, immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. Okay, so this is what Peter is referring to when he says in verse 12, let's jump back to 2 Peter 3:12, when he says, wherein the heavens being on fire shall be dissolved, the elements shall melt with fervent heat. And up here again he says, the heavens shall pass away with a great noise, the elements shall melt with fervent heat. So the heavens here are sun, moon, stars. Okay, now so I was saying that a literal understanding of this poses a lot of problems, because it would mean that not just the earth, the planet earth, would be affected with that understanding. It would mean that not only the earth would be affected by the passing of the heavens and earth, but also the solar system. So the moon would be affected, the sun would be affected, and the stars, which are the other planets and galaxies, would according to this, according to Jesus, he says the stars shall fall. And according to Peter, they shall melt with fervent heat, and they will pass away with a great noise. Okay? So there's obvious problems, and I don't know of any, as I said. That doesn't mean that there aren't any, but I don't know of any churches or denominations who have that understanding that all the galaxies and the planets and the stars and the solar systems would be affected by Christ coming to the earth and instituting or implementing or establishing a new heaven and earth, and the old heavens and earth passing away. I don't know of anyone who has that belief. But as we saw in point number 1 of this study, and if you haven't seen the first 2 studies, the first part and the second part, in point number 1 of the first part, we established that Jesus, when he was speaking of the heavens and the earth, his understanding of heavens and earth was the covenant relationship between God and Israel. Okay? And obviously, if Jesus had that understanding, Peter would also have that understanding, as we saw in the previous study, right? So, if we apply that same understanding here, then there is no conflict, there is no stretching of the imagination. But just to understand, Peter is using, yes, these language here to describe a passing of the old covenant system, the old covenant world, as we saw in our previous study, that this was how it was viewed, okay? The old covenant world which God established for Israel, with that was passing, and then a new covenant world would replace it, okay? So that is more in harmony with the Hebrew understanding. But you see, if you're coming to the scripture with a Greek modern mindset, then you're going to be more likely to take these things in a literalistic way, right? But we have to allow Peter and the apostles and Jesus to explain to us what they are. What is it they are? They saying? Are they speaking of the material creation, which in the previous studies we already discovered they were not? Okay, and to expand upon that, you need to go and watch the previous studies. All right. So Peter was not mentioning or not indicating or not speaking of the material creation. He was not talking about the galactic heavens. He was not talking about the Milky Way or the literal sun, the literal moon, the literal stars, nor any of that. Peter and Jesus were using standard language of the prophets, the standard language of the ancient prophets. And by using these kinds of language were serving as spiritual bookmarks. Okay, what do I mean by that? You see, these language are actually borrowed word for word from what the ancient prophets said concerning specific events that happened in history. Okay? So for example, if we go to Isaiah 13 verse 10, you'll see an example of this. Okay? Isaiah 13 verse 10. We see here in verse 10, look at what Isaiah wrote. He says, "For the stars of heaven and the constellations thereof shall not give their light. The sun shall be darkened in his going forth, and the moon shall not cause her light to shine." Okay, so this is the same language that Jesus used. This is the same language that Peter used, right? And why are they using it? Because they knew the audience to which they are speaking. Remember, Peter's audience were the strangers. okay, those Israelites who were remnant, and because of their remnant status, they became strangers. They became alienated from, in the eyes of the body of Israel, they were like cast out because of what they believed concerning the Messiah. So they became like strangers. But in the eyes of God, they were the true Israel. All right. But anyway, so that was his audience. He was writing to people who knew. He says, I'm writing to stir up your remembrance of what the holy prophets wrote. Okay. So again, so he's pulling this from the holy prophets again. Right. And so, because he knew his audience, and he knew when they heard these terms, their minds would go back to what was happening when Isaiah wrote what he wrote. Okay, so let's ask the question: when Isaiah wrote here about the stars of heaven and the constellations not giving their light, and the sun darkening, and the moon not shining or not giving light, what was he talking about? Right? What was he talking about? Because was there some time in history when all the entire solar system and galaxies just went black and stopped giving light? Did that ever happen? No, right? So what was Isaiah speaking about? Right? So to get our context, we go to verse 1. Okay? And we see here Isaiah said or wrote the burden of Babylon, which Isaiah the son of Amos did see. So whenever the prophet Isaiah, and I think Ezekiel as well, and I think Jeremiah, but when they use this term, the burden of Babylon, or burden of whatever nation, it is the pronouncement of the judgment of God upon said nation. And most times, the judgment of God was coming up upon said nation because of that nation's ill treatment or mistreatment of Israel. So here, judgment was coming upon Babylon for Babylon's wickedness. All right? So the context of Isaiah 13 is God pronouncing judgment on Babylon. All right? So the burden of Babylon. Let's go down to verse 9. If you want, in your time, you can read the entire chapter and get a better picture. But I'm pulling out these to show you it's the judgment of Babylon and how that judgment would be brought to pass, or how would it be implemented. Verse 9, behold, the day of the Lord comes, cruel, both with wrath and fierce anger, to lay the land desolate, and he shall destroy the sinners thereof out of it. So here, remember the context. The context of Isaiah 13 is the judgment of Babylon. So when it says here, the day of the Lord comes, it was coming to Babylon. Okay? Cruel, both with wrath and fierce anger. And by the way, if you are a good student of Scripture, you would see that there were many days of the Lord. A day of the Lord is basically a day of judgment where God would execute the punishment of that judgment. That would be the day of the Lord. And they had days of the Lord for Babylon. They had days of the Lord for Edom, which we will look at in this study. We had days of the Lord for Egypt. You had days of the Lord for ancient Israel also, right? So the day of the Lord was the day of judgment for that particular nation. To lay the land desolate. Which land? The land of Babylon, the territory or the empire of Babylon. He shall destroy sinners thereof out of it. Verse 10 now is the text which we just read. For the stars of heaven and the constellations thereof shall not give their light. The sun shall be darkened in his going forth, and the moon shall not cause her light to shine. So we notice the context of which this language is used is concerning a day of the Lord. in which God's judgment upon a nation for its treatment of Israel. All right? Let's continue. Verse 11. And I will punish the world for their evil. Remember, context. I will punish the world. What world? The world of Babylon. Babylon was an empire that, and remember, this word world is similar to the word, the Greek word cosmos, right? And it means a system, or a system of order under which men live and abide by its laws and principles, right? And that system could be a global system, or it could be segments. It could be local, right? It could be regional. It could be sectarian. In other words, we talk about the crime world, the fashion world, the sports world, okay? Each of these sects or segments of society are governed by specific principles by which the people who are in those worlds abide by. As well as there could have been, in Jesus' time, there was the Israelite world or the Mosaic world, right? Or the Sinai covenant world, which are all synonymous, which they had specific laws and principles unique to that world, which those who are in or part of that world abided by, right? So when we have to understand, when the Bible uses the word world, it doesn't always mean, in the most cases, it does not mean the entire globe. It doesn't mean everybody. It just means people who are living, in this case, in Babylon, the Babylonian world, because remember, the context was Babylon. And in any case, Babylon at this time was basically ruling the majority of the then known world, in any case, right? But that world was still not not all the nations, because they were not ruling over in China with all these great Chinese and Asian empires that they had. Babylon did not reach over to that side, okay? So anyway, so he will punish the world of Babylon for their evil, the wicked for their iniquity. I'll cause the arrogance of the proud to cease. I will lay low the haughtiness of the terrible. Okay, let's go down to verse 13. Therefore I will shake the heavens, and the earth shall move out of her place in the wrath of the Lord of hosts in the day of his fierce anger. So was there a time when God judged Babylon? And I think this would probably be around 539 BC, right? Which would be, from our perspective today, from the 21st century, would be roughly 2,600 years ago, 2,600 years ago. Was there a time, sometime 2,600 years ago, when the entire planet went through a shaking? And the heavens, meaning the starry heavens, were shaken, and the earth was moved out of its place? Did that literally happen? Or was it referring to Babylon and all that was associated with it? Right? You have to understand how these language were used. Let's look at verse 17 to get a little more information. As I said, you can read and see it also. Behold, I will stir up the Medes against them. Who's the them? Babylon, which shall not regard silver, and as for gold, they shall not delight in it. Verse 18, their bows, these are weapons of the Medes, shall dash the young men to pieces, and they, the Medes, shall have no pity on the fruit of the womb. So even the little children in the unborn babies will not be spared in this destruction that was coming upon Babylon. For their eyes shall not spare children. Okay, look at verse 19. And Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, the beauty of the Chaldees' excellency, shall be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. All right? So here a cataclysmic, catastrophic destruction was coming to Babylon, and God is saying, well, I am sending it because of Babylon's wickedness, and I'm sending it through an army which I will stir up. And that army will come and they will have no pity on the people of Babylon, right? It will be destroyed. All right? So the language used now was not literal, but it's simply there to give the enormity. Because when this calamity, when this destruction came upon Babylon, it would be as if their entire world is destroyed. It's as if they have been uncreated. Because remember, at the creation, God created the heavens and the earth, and he put the stars and the sun and the moon in place and established them and all of that. So it's as if God has uncreated. I don't know if that's a word, but I am now creating that word, okay? So don't go in your dictionary and look for uncreate. But I'm just using it as the opposite of creation. So instead of God establishing something, he is now reversing the creation of this nation or this empire, right? So that's why it's like as a complete destruction, not just the land, but also the heavens have been removed, right? Let's look at another one. Isaiah 34, it's in Isaiah again, 34 verse 4 to 6. It says there, and all the host of heaven shall be dissolved. Again, this is the same thing what Peter was saying. And the heaven shall be rolled together as a scroll. And all their host, meaning all the stars, all the host of heaven, which is the stars, okay, shall fall down, as the leaf falls off from the vine, and as a fallen fig from the fig tree. Okay, so here's another event Isaiah speaks of, wherein the host of heaven, so this is the entire, if we were taking it literally speaking, it would be the entire cosmic heavens, all the galaxies and all the different solar systems, planets, all that you can look up in the sky and see. It says all of that is going to be dissolved. Now, if we are taking this literally, this is, I've never heard anybody say that this is how they understand it. That all the stars, everything gonna be just wiped away. Just because of this one planet, Earth. Just because of God judging one planet, he has to destroy all the other planets which were never even touched or influenced in any way by what happened on the earth. God will destroy every other planet. Okay? So we have to really think carefully about what these prophecies are really saying. Okay? So anyway, look at verse 5 now. It says, for my sword, God speaking, for my sword shall be bathed in heaven. Behold, it shall come down on Idumea, which is the city or kingdom of Edom. Okay, I remember Edom now was formed by the descendants of Esau, right? And the descendants of Esau, even though Jacob and Esau made peace eventually, but the descendants of Esau still warred against the descendants of Jacob. So Edom and Israel were enemies, okay? So because of that, God now was pronouncing through Isaiah judgment on Edom, on the descendants of Esau. And it says here, my sword shall be bathed in heaven. Do we actually think that God has a sword a literal metal weapon in heaven, and he's up there cleaning it, because he's up, just like in the ancient days before the soldiers went into battle. They would have to make sure that their swords are shine and clean, because that would make it easier for them and sharpen them and so on, so that it would be easier for them to kill their enemy. Okay, is God saying that literally he had a sword in heaven and he was there cleaning it up because he was about to go into battle? No. So all of this is symbolic language, right? So we have to understand that the majority of what Jesus spoke was symbolic. He even said that in John 16:25. He says, I have spoken to you, meaning to his disciples, in Proverbs, right? I have spoken to you in Proverbs. So right here we have an evidence that all that he said up here, with the heavens rolled together as a scroll, the host falling down, the leaf falling, the stars falling as leaves off of a vine and a fig tree, all of that is also symbolic. It has a symbolic meaning, right? So verse 5, people will say, oh, well, verse 5 is symbolic, but verse 4 is literal. Okay, look what it says in verse 6. But let me continue verse 5, by the way. For my sword shall be bathed in heaven. Behold, it shall come down. So God, do you think that God will drop a sword on a nation? No, what is he saying? He is saying that he will allow, the sword means an enemy army. Okay? So you'll allow an enemy army, because remember, in those days, the weapon of choice was the sword, the bow and the sword, okay? So he was talking about an enemy army will come to Edom to destroy it, in fulfillment of God's judgment against that nation because of Edom's treatment of Israel, right? So he says, and on the people, the sword shall come down on the people of my curse. To judgment. To what? Judgment, right? So it's talking about the judgment of Edom. So notice this language which Peter used, this language which Jesus used, is used in connection with judgment, and the judgment of nations which ill-treated or mistreated Israel. Good? Look at verse 6. The sword of the Lord is filled with blood. Okay? It is made fat with fatness, and with the blood of lambs and of goats, with the fat of the kidneys of rams. For the Lord has a sacrifice in Bozrah. Now, Bozrah was the capital city of Edom. Okay? Bozrah was a city in Edom. So there was going to be a sacrifice and a great slaughter. Now look at the parallels. Okay? You have the language being used. Excuse me. The language being used. Stars will fall from heaven. The heavens will roll back. The heavens will be shaken. The constellations will be dissolved. The earth will be moved out of its place. In connection with what? In connection with the judgment of these nations for their mistreatment of Israel. That judgment will come through the sword, meaning an enemy army, coming up against that army and destroying it. Right? Look at the parallel now. What did Jesus say would happen to Jerusalem? He says, well, Jerusalem, because of your historical treatment of the prophets of God, and at that time, from when he was speaking it in the year 30, he says, and Israel will also kill the prophets of Jesus, meaning the apostles, and the martyrs of Christ, like Stephen, right? He says, because of your killing of the prophets that he would send, he says, then the wrath of God will come upon Jerusalem. They will be surrounded by the armies of Rome, and they will be given into the hands of the armies of Rome, and Rome will come in and they will leave not one stone standing. Isn't that the same thing? Isn't that the same judgment that came upon Babylon? Isn't that the same judgment that came upon Edom and several other nations, which I will not cover, but you can discover them by just doing a basic search of the Old Testament. You will see these things happen. Isn't that the same thing that Jesus was pronouncing on Jerusalem, and therefore he would now use the same kind of language that the ancient prophets used when these kinds of judgments were done? Yes. Okay. So whenever these things happen, this was the kind of wording, this was the kind of language that was used. Okay. Now, so an enemy army was going to be used to judge Edom. And the sword was God's way of saying the attacking army was going to shed blood, going to slaughter the people of that land. And that would be a judgment of that nation because of its treatment of Israel. All right? So each nation, as I said, was considered as its own cosmos or world. Thus, the destruction of that nation was the destruction of its world. Similarly, the destruction of the heavens and earth in Peter's time was the destruction of Israel, its city, its temple, its people, its world, that old world, using now the Roman army as the sword of God's judgment and replacing that old world or that old heavens and earth with a new world or a new heavens and earth wherein dwelleth righteousness.